Welcome to Fast Talk, the Velo News podcast and everything you need to know to ride like a pro.
Hello and welcome to Fast Talk. I'm your host, Chris Case, managing editor of Velo News, joined as always by the guy who loves the Twilight Zone as much as he loves a good conversation about training zones, Coach Trevor Connor. That little intro there should give you a hint at the topic of today's episode's training zones. There's possibly nothing more ubiquitous in all of cycling, and Trevor and I have lost count of the number of questions we received from listeners that start with something along the lines of, I was training in Zone 4 when... The truth of the matter is that we don't know exactly what you mean when you tell us something like that. And that's not because we don't know training science, but because Zone 4 can mean a lot of different things. One thing is certain, training zones can have tremendous value. They provide guidance for training and a means of communicating with your coach or your teammates. If you're a fan of zones, this episode may also challenge you because zones have their limitations. They're not as clear-cut as they seem, which may be why we and all of our guests today resist even using the term zones. What we hope to communicate is that there is no single zone model. That's because there is no perfect zone model. They all have flaws. What they're based on, FTP, VO2 max, or power duration, all have their issues. Nor can any model ever fully account for individual variation or even day-to-day variation within each athlete. As our guests will point out, they are rough and they have their limitations. That being said, if you use a zone model based on your physiology and use it as a guide, not as dogma, it can be a valuable tool. So today we'll dive into zones, or levels, or ranges, or whatever you want to call them, and talk about several things. First, what exactly a zone model is and whether it should be based on power or heart rate. The value of a zone system as a framework for training and, more importantly, communication. 3. While there are many zone models based on heart rate, there are actually very few based on power. That's partially because Dr. Andy Coggan and Hunter Allen came up with a model that's been the standard. We'll talk about this model and why it was so important for each zone to have a name and not just a number. Coggan's classic zone model has 7 zones. We'll talk about the issues with more or fewer zones, including Dr. Steven Seiler's 3-zone model and whether or not it's based on physiology. 5. What a zone model should be based on. Most systems create zones that are a percentage of VO2 max or FTP or threshold. We'll talk about the pros and cons of each and how, ultimately, both have their limitations. Number 6. Other limitations with zones, including not understanding what, quote, Zone 2 means, and the fact that just because you're training in a particular zone doesn't mean you're doing the right training. There are other factors, including volume. Finally, we'll talk about the eye levels that are discussed in the 3rd edition of Training and Racing with a Power Meter. Eye levels are based on an athlete's individual profile, not just FTP, and address many of the shortcomings we'll discuss. I mentioned that book, Training and Racing with a Power Meter, because our primary guests today are renowned physiologists and coaches who need no introduction and who are the authors of that book. Dr. Andy Coggan, Dr. Stephen McGregor, and a guest you've heard from on Fast Talk before, Hunter Allen. We also talk with local coach and Fast Talk regular, Colby Pierce, to get his opinion about zones. As a top-level coach figuring out how to best direct his athletes, he had a lot of great insight about zones and their limits. We also talk with Dr. Steven Seiler, one of the originators of the polarized training model, to get his take on training zones and why he often promotes a 3-zone model. You may be surprised by his answer. Finally, we'll touch base with Sebastian Weber with INSCYD and a coach to athletes like Tony Martin and Peter Sagan in the past. We ask him his opinion on whether zones should be based on a percentage of VO2 max or threshold, but it quickly turns into a more nuanced conversation about the dangers of blindly following zones. So, get ready to enter a dimension as vast as space and as timeless as infinity. It is the middle ground between light and shadow, between science and superstition, and it lies between the pit of man's fears and the summit of his knowledge. This is the dimension of imagination. It is an area we like to call the Twilight Zone. Oh, wait, that's the wrong show. This is Fast Talk. Let's make you fast.
Today's episode of Fast Talk is sponsored by Whoop. Chris and I are really excited to have Whoop on board, and this is not just because it's another device I get to wear around all day and completely geek over. You've probably heard me say on the show, and I certainly say this to every athlete I coach, the issue I have with the 6-week training block is it might fit perfectly into the plan to say you should do a 5-hour hard ride 5 Wednesdays from now, but the fact of the matter is I have no idea how you're going to feel then. It might be you have a bad night of sleep. You might have gotten into a fight with your spouse. Your kids might be sick. And that 5-hour ride that looks perfect right now might be absolutely the wrong choice for you. We're all great at doing the training, but where we're not great is getting the recovery and knowing when not to do the training or knowing when to adjust. So that's where Whoop comes in. Whoop is a wrist-based strap that monitors heart rate variability all day. Whoop lets you know how strenuous your training was. It lets you know how recovered your body is. And it gives you indicators of the quality of your sleep. All this comes together into recommendations in its apps of basically how ready are you to train. It's going to give you the guidance to look at your training plan and say, that hard workout I have for today, that might have looked right a week ago, but today I need to adjust. Or it might tell you all clear, go out and tear it apart. So we're excited to have Whoop on board, and we hope you check them out to make the best daily training decisions. Today's episode is also sponsored by Oat Route. What is Oat Route? Well, it's not a cycling tour, it's more than a road race. As a matter of fact, if you're interested, check out last week's episode where we really talked about this type of event. It's a multi-day Grand Fondo style event where everyone starts together each morning and you can ride with friends all day. You can indulge your competitive side on timed sections if you feel like it and explore iconic cycling destinations around the world. It's kind of the best of getting in some racing while doing a fantastic tour. But Oat Route takes it a little further with Pro Tour style support on the bike and rider-focused amenities off it. Choose from a dozen events in 2019 in France, Italy, Norway, Oman, Mexico, and China. In the United States, there's still entries available for Oat Route Asheville in May, that's coming up pretty quick, and Oat Route San Francisco in September. Try something new in 2019. Try Oat Route.
Well, it's great to have Hunter Allen back on the show, and I want to welcome Andy Coggan, Dr. Andy Coggan, and Dr. Stephen McGregor to the show for the first time. Welcome to Fast Talk, guys.
Hey.
Thanks.
And today we want to talk a lot about training zones and eye levels and the concepts surrounding those ideas, but we also want to be sure to point out that we're talking about these things because you guys have launched a new book, Training with Power. It's the 3rd edition, correct?
Yeah, 3rd edition. We can. It's pretty exciting to have this 3rd edition. It's been a long time coming. The 2nd edition was 2009. We released it, and the 2nd edition, sold over 100,000 copies, and that's not even really considering what's sold internationally in 7 or 8 languages now, I think. Yeah, so that's pretty exciting. So the 3rd edition, it's looking good. We're sitting here at Andy's kitchen table right now. Andy and I are signing 1,000 books. So and then Steve is going to get to sign the 1,000 books later this weekend in Boston with us.
Nice.
That's a lot of signatures.
That's some endurance, hand endurance work.
Andy's been complaining all morning long. My hand's cramping. More electrolytes. More goo.
I've been training, so I'll be fine.
Very good.
Spending 5-10 minutes every morning just writing your signature, getting that endurance up.
Oh no, couple hours.
There we go.
Or I wanted to over distance training.
Well, so I mean, and this is also, you look at the editions of your book. Your first edition was really, nobody had addressed how to train with power. So your first edition was just saying basically, how do you take this power meter, this new device, and use it? How do you interpret any of this information and make it in any way valuable? and please after correct me if I'm wrong on any of this. The second edition of the book is where you really brought in concepts like the performance management chart. But there has been, since the second book, just this huge revolution, which the three of you are mostly responsible for, in the sort of metrics that we can get out of power. And it's, I read through most of the book before this podcast, and you've really dive deep into all these higher level metrics such as stamina and Pmax and FRC that just certainly weren't in the last two editions of the book. So it's really exciting to see what we're able to get out of power data and the sort of sophistication of the metrics. I'm sorry, that wasn't the best explanation, but please tell us kind of your feeling about this third edition.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that's exactly it. I mean, in 10 years, there's been a continual evolution of training with power, and we've learned more, and we've got more. Software has gotten better, and the tools that we have to analyze data have improved, and so that's been a big part of it. Andy, go ahead and chime in here. I mean, you were the one who really started thinking about some of these newer concepts and metrics and creating them. So,
and if I can step on Andy's toes here real quick, and I do want to up front say that you said the three of us were responsible. And honestly, I always have to tip my hat to Andy. Andy is really the preeminent mind in power training. And to be honest, I'm a hanger on. I run the coattails, and I always want to be upfront about that, saying a lot of the things I've done in the world of analytics for performance where Andy is leading the way, especially in cycling and power. So I just want to make sure I got that in there and give him his due before he goes on and kind of talks about it a bit.
Yeah.
Thank you, Steve. You're second in the mail.
Well, thanks.
Yeah, I joked at one point that really what has led to the book, but it was more power-based training 2.0. And that was the reinvigoration of the WKO software, led Hunter and I and Kevin Williams, the programmer, and others to get together and really start taking a second look at what could be done, with the overall goal being to try and leverage the data to make things more individualized. So power-based training 1.0 was a systematic approach, but more at, I don't want to say a generic level, if you will, applicable to everyone, for trying to provide people with the language, the lingua franca, to exchange information and ideas, etc. Whereas power-based training 2.0, the attempt was to make things more individualized.
One thing to show the influence that you've had, I mean, when you first came out with your initial concepts, when you first came out with your book, you really gave a lot of credit to previous research, such as the work by Bannister on heart rate, and drew a lot from the previous science. But what I have found fascinating is when I was looking at some of these higher level metrics and started reading the research out there, they kept referring to your MFTP. They kept referring to your performance management chart. As a matter of fact, one of the research studies I read literally had a screenshot of the PMC straight out of Training Peaks. So it's gone from you drawing heavily on the previous science to now the science is really drawing heavily on what you have created.
Well, was it Einstein who said we all stand on the shoulders of giants? But that it kind of comes back to the notion of individualization in the topic today. I like to. We have pithy power proverbs that have been around for decades. One of which is they're called levels and not zones for a reason, and we'll get into that because I know you're interested in discussing that topic in particular. But I actually stole and I've made no bones about it. I stole the term levels from a schema that Peter Keene, Chris Boardman's coach, had put together, where he had laid out various training levels. And it resonated with me in particular because he had verbal description of sort of the sensations that an individual experienced when exercising at these different intensities. So I borrowed from that, and I borrowed from other places.
Andy, does it make you feel old when you say pithy power proverbs that have been around for decades.
No, my kids make me feel old.
There you go.
I don't need you.
My nephew came out to visit in Colorado this weekend, and I went skiing with him, and I lost count of the number of times he was going, Trevor, old people like you. And then he would explain to me about what I didn't understand about being old.
Right.
It's the beard. It's the gray beard you got going right now. That's a big sign. Over the hill.
So, well, now that we brought up all these, kind of hinted at all these great, very sophisticated new metrics you have in the book, we're actually going to focus on, I think, what was in chapter 2 or maybe chapter 3 and get right back to the basics and talk about this whole concept of training zones. And I will say personally, and I think you share some of this, I'm a bit of a zone skeptic. I hate it when I'm out in a ride and I hear somebody say, oh, I'm doing a zone 2 ride. And I'm the same as you. I don't actually use the term zones with my athletes. I landed on ranges to kind of imply the fact that each physiological system has a fairly large range and they can overlap. But I guess the starting point is talking about zone systems generically. How would you define them? What is a zone model?
That's you, Andy.
You got me. So I'll stall for time. My original interest in dabbling in this area was actually piqued by a conversation I had in the infield at the Velodrome in Trexlertown, where I overheard John Verheuel, who at the time was part of Adam Hodges-Meyerson's coaching group, saying that he wanted to be one of the leaders in power-based training, and he wanted to convert their heart rate zones to power zones. And so I chatted with John a little bit, and then on my drive home from the Velodrome, I started thinking about the fact that, yes, we have these devices out there. You've got people like Greg LeMond using them. You've got the Australians using them. But there really wasn't anybody who was trying to present and package the information for the masses. The elites who are in the business of winning medals and making big money had their knowledge, but they weren't motivated to share it. So I kind of set out to provide a way for others to benefit from the knowledge that exercise physiology could provide. So my original contribution were the original training levels, and it just kind of snowballed from there. But again, it comes back to, I always call them levels and not zones, because you do have zone-based training originates mostly from the use of heart rate monitors and other sports as well. If you think about, of course, runners go more by pace and swimmers struggle with heart rate in the water, but nonetheless, you can, use your polar heart rate monitor from the 1980s and you can prescribe training and you can say, go out and train in this zone, with the goal being to try and elicit certain adaptations. And that kind of approach is it's not logical, as you were pointing out. Exercise responses occur on a physiological continuum, but it's also not as readily applicable to cycling, which I describe as a free range activity. If you go out and run, you're running. If you slow down too much, you're walking and you know it, so you never slow down too much. But cyclists can, go gangbusters up a hill and then they coast down the other side without turning a pedal stroke. So the exercise intensity varies a lot more. You're far more dependent upon, the terrain, the environment, etc. So, power output ends up being, seemingly stochastic. It's not truly random, but it is highly variable, which is not, other sports. So I kind of had that in mind, being a cyclist and calling them levels and not zones. Yeah, I was fighting against this notion that you lock yourself into some rigid constraints with respect to exercise intensity.
Right, which I'm personally very glad to hear. But going back to the kind of that original concept of zones, it was just that idea that you're training different systems or having different effects, and I'm trying to talk very generically here, at different intensities. So let's divide those intensities into zones to give some guidance on how you train. And I actually took some time before this podcast to go through a whole bunch of the various zone systems to see how they break out. And you can really see some of the earlier systems, there doesn't seem to be a lot of physiological basis behind them. So, for example, and I'm going to butcher the pronunciation, even though, well, you were practicing signatures, I was trying to practice how to say this. You have the original Carbonin zones, which are based on heart rate variability. But literally, his zone 1 was just 50 to 60%. Zone 2 is 60 to 70%. Zone 3 is 70 to 80%, which I have to think that's just kind of basic rounding versus I don't think specific physiological effects happen at 60, 70, 80, and 90%.
just by
or,
chance.
or am I wrong there?
Well, just if I could interject real quick. So two things. One is the component is not based on heart rate variability. It's just based on a heart rate normalization score, which is a different animal. But that's one of the limitations.
Oh, sorry, that's what I meant.
Right. So that's one of the limitations, inherent limitations to heart rate. You talk about 50 to 60% or 60 to 7% and rounding. Honestly, with heart rate, it doesn't matter. Heart rate is the resolution of heart rate is so low, and for lack of a better term, the accuracy of heart rate, which is not necessarily the correct term, but if the idea is to hit an intensity level. So if we were using power and we said, okay, we want you to go out and do, and what they call them, L3 or L4, L5, give them a level designation, just say a number. I want you to go and do intervals at 300 watts, right? If you give a heart rate target, then the heart rate target could vary by, 5. It could be right on the nose from a power or a perceived exertion standpoint. But it could be, 20, 30, it could be 10, 20% off with regard to the target power, because heart rate is a response. It's not the actual effort level, right? So the rounding errors in heart rate, you're right. But there's so much, again, for lack of a better term, inaccuracy with regard to heart rate measures that it's kind of irrelevant. It doesn't matter. So that's how close you hit the target in heart rate. It's kind of beside the point. You're using heart rate.
So before we go into, we'll cover your specific systems towards the end of the podcast. So still talking now about just zone systems in general. What, in your opinion, makes a good zone system versus a bad zone system? And even at a higher level, do we really need a zone system?
Well, from a coaching perspective, it allows me to prescribe workouts, and I think that's the biggest point that makes a big difference for the athlete as well. And I think that's where power training levels said, hey, look, okay, if we're between this range and this range, we know that you're training your FTP. We know that you're training your VO2 max. We know that you're improving one energy system or the other. And if you roughly adhere to some time components as well, then it's not a guarantee, but it's damn close to a guarantee that you're actually training where you need to train. And having a power meter and being able to quantify those numbers and say, okay, I need you to hold between 300 and 320 watts for 5 minutes to do this interval at your VO2 max, then that gives a very clear instruction for the rider to be able to do that, and as a goal, and also for something to execute. So from that coaching perspective, it gives clarity on how to coach an athlete, and then also gives us confidence as coaches to say, okay, I'm training them in the right area, the right energy system to get the adaptation that I want.
So we, interestingly, last week had Sebastian Weber on the show, and so we'll actually put this in this episode, but we asked him his feelings. And he said he never gives his athletes zones, but what he does is when he prescribes a workout, he tells them what power range he wants them to do that workout in. So do you think that's sufficient, or do you feel there's still a value to giving your athletes specific zones beyond the workout?
It's 6 of one, half dozen of the other is really what it boils down to, is that if you're giving a person a power range and you're giving the person a zone, it's the same thing. So depending on what if the zone or level range, if you will, falls between 260 and 290 watts for, say, a quote unquote L3 workout or efforts, you give the person power range of 260 to 290 watts, you've done essentially the same thing, right? So to say you don't give somebody zones or levels, you really are. It's just you're calling it by another name.
So basically what you're saying is he's still giving his athletes zones. He's just giving them one zone at a time with each workout.
He's providing quantitative advice as to how they should execute the training session. Now, if you're dealing with one athlete or if you're dealing with 6 athletes, yes, I could sit there and tell athlete A, go out today and hold between 210 and 240 watts for 6 hours. And I could tell athlete B, you do 270 to 325 or whatever. But if you're dealing with more than 6 athletes, you need some systematic approach in order to aid in communication, to standardize things. And that's really what this is all about. I mean, Hunter used the word clarity. It's a system to standardize communication. With the recognition, of course, that physiological responses occur on a continuum. Physiological adaptations are a result of that continuum. Nonetheless, humans have difficulty dealing with shades of gray. So we paint it as a bit more black and white, and we say, there are 7 training levels because it's a way of aiding in communication, especially with dealing with large numbers of individuals. But anyone who thinks that there's magic in training at a particular intensity, just doesn't understand. Well, first, they don't understand how the body responds to exercise, but they also don't understand what, Hunter and I, and then what Steve joined in, have been trying to educate people about for the past 2 decades. Again, I come back to, they're called levels and not zones for a reason. They've always been called levels.
Yes.
And I've railed against this. If you're not as been around as long as I have, you may not remember the era in which people were discouraged from going too hard in the off season because they will, blow up their capillaries. And you'd go out and ride. Snicker. I hear you, Steve. And you go out and ride with your friends. They'd be adamant. It's like, no, I have to, get off my bike and walk up this hill because I'll blow up my capillaries. That's ridiculous. That's not how people ride bikes in the real world. So if you overly constrain somebody's power output because of the way you're prescribing training, all you're doing is making the training less specific. You go back to the original system that I put out there back in 2001 now, it refers to the average power either for the interval, if you're talking about interval type work, or it refers to the average power for the entire workout if you were talking about just a steady state endurance ride, or if it's something like a tempo session, well, you warm up and you cool down, but you focus on what was the average power over the hour and a half in the middle. But that doesn't mean that power remains within that range at all times. In fact, the exact opposite is what you really should be aiming for, because we don't go out and time trial everywhere, at least not in mass races.
And this actually goes back to what you were talking about with regard to the reasons for zones and kind of the problem with zones. Is Andy kind of cited a popular notion from back in the day, which seems like only yesterday, but which actually was 15 years ago, blowing up capillaries. But also I can think back farther than that, and which has kind of still been around for a while, is the notion of no man's land, right? That was a particular zone to stay away from. So there's zones you want to target and zones you want to stay away from. And actually, in actuality, most of what a lot of people would consider no man's land is actually the place that a lot of us spend, or racers spend a fair bit of time actually riding their bike. So it's a zone or it's an effort level that you actually have to be in at some point, whether it's in training to race effectively or racing effectively, right? Avoiding it like the plague, like it's going to cause some type of undue damage, is really a misguided notion. And so the other aspect of, again, quote unquote levels or zones, is that they give a standardization, a framework for people, because in the case of the book, when it first came out, without that framework, it's really difficult to describe things to people on a generally applicable basis. We can say generic basis, but it's generally applicable, right? So what applies to one person applies, close enough for horseshoes and hand grenades to another person, but maybe not exactly, right? But close enough so you can kind of work out the details yourself. The zones and levels just really provide a framework for people to use as guides. And the problem is a lot of people take guides and frameworks as gospel, and it's not gospel. training in a particular area, zone, level, whatever you want to call it, is not going to cause undue damage unless it's done disproportionately. And then you get a disproportional adaptation and de-adaptation in the other areas you're not training.
One thing I love about constantly interviewing people smarter and more experienced than me is you hear common themes expressed in almost the exact same wording. That was certainly the case when we asked Colby Pierce his opinion about training zones. He talks about their value as a communication tool almost verbatim to what you just heard from Dr. Coggan. But he goes on to explain why, even though they are a great guide, they shouldn't be used dogmatically. What's your feeling about any sort of zone model, just zone models in general?
What are we talking about here? I think some of it comes down to semantics. Like I've heard people say, I was in zone 2. Well, what does that mean? And they can't really tell you. I think that zones can be a useful language. We have to have a common language to discuss intensity with our athletes. And I think zones tries to assume that language. There are problems with that language at times, and there are problems with that communication. So one of the biggest problems I have with it is, let's say, I get this question a lot with my athletes. Let's say that I ask them to do 5-minute intervals. Ostensibly, for most athletes who are relatively fit, a 5-minute interval is going to be close to their VO2 max power, right? Depending on the recovery interval. Just for the sake of argument, let's just say that it is. So most athletes are doing 5-minute intervals. They're approaching VO2 power. They're at VO2 power. But there's a chicken egg thing here, because some athletes will say, okay, I want you to use eye levels, or I want you to use whatever wizardry you're going to use with your magical laptop machine, and tell me what power I should be doing, quote unquote. And my response will be, well, I don't want you to necessarily target a power on this day, because particularly at this time of year, meaning March, these training days are about simply doing the work. So if we want you to do work at VO2 level on a given day, whatever your power is for that day is what it is. I want you to ride based off your perceived exertion of what VO2 is. And on one day, because you might be carrying some fatigue, maybe that's 330 watts. And maybe on another day it's 350, and maybe on another day it's 360. But I don't want you to stop the workout if your first 2 5-minute intervals are 335 and your eyeballs are bleeding and you feel as though that is your VO2 level effort for the day. That doesn't mean we're not going to get constructive work for you to finish the workout. In fact, arguably, we could be getting really, really powerful benefit from you doing a 20-minute total load at that wattage. So I want you to focus on RPE. So I think where things get confusing is when people are training, when a coach writes a workout for an athlete is training, are they really trying to achieve a certain zone on power, i.e. output during a workout, or are they registering their own internal exertion level of that? And then when you add heart rate into that equation, which is arguably very important, athletes can get really confused. So then that leads to the situation where you, Trevor, go to an athlete and say, how was your ride the other day? And they say, I did a zone 2 for 5 hours. And you say, what does that mean? And they're like, I'm not really sure, because at the beginning I was doing 240 watts, and then about midway through I was down to 200, but then my heart rate went from, mid 120s up to mid 130s. Right. And then by the end it got kind of warm, and then, we were going to stop for water, but I didn't know the guy who stopped, and the other guy wasn't really eating. So, I didn't feel like I should eat, because eating is cheating. And so by the end I was doing 190 watts and my heart rate was floating towards the mid 140s. And then you look at their RPE. So we've got 3 different models going for how to track their zone that they were in. Which one are we paying attention to? So it comes down to the definition of the semantics. It comes down to clear communication with your athlete. What does the zone actually mean? Which metric are we using to track that zone? Are we using power? Are we using heart rate? Are we using perceived exertion? 3 different things.
I think you're really touching on an important theme that we've heard time and time again. And Dr. Coggan, even in the discussion with him, he brought this up, that, as you said, these zones are good for guidance and for giving a common language. Mm-hmm. But at the end of the day, if you want to train your best, you're not going to get there by simply saying, well, my zone 4 is X and I trained in that wattage. You have to take responsibility and say, I don't care that I was supposed to ride at 300 watts.
Yes.
This didn't feel right today.
All right.
Yep. And know how to adjust. It's just more complex than that.
Ultimately, power and heart rate are simply metrics we use to really see what's happening inside the athlete, their adaptation and their effort for the day. And power is not the goal. I have to reinforce this with my athletes all the time. Like, I don't really care how many watts you're doing, man. If you're a competitive athlete, I want to see you get results. I want to see you win the races you want to win, or have the best performance on your day of your race that you can have. If you're doing 289 watts or 410, I could give a shit.
Let's return to the show and hear why Dr. Coggan landed on 7 levels for his classic levels.
I was going to say, I'd like to circle back to the question you asked originally and what represents a good system. I'll presage another question I know that you wanted to address, and that is what you use as your anchor point. So I would up front say it makes perfect sense from a physiological perspective that your anchor point has to be your metabolic fitness. But with that said, one of the issues that I had to take into consideration with the original levels was, what is the right number? Recognizing that it's all shades of gray and that subdividing things into ranges or regions or zones or levels or whatever you want to call them is simply a mental convenience. Well, how far do you go? If you set up 15 different levels, that better reflects the continuum, but it's rather unwieldy. Right. On the other hand, if you have a 3-zone system and you're an advocate of polarized training, well, if you think you're never going to train in zone 2 and that everything should be 65% of VO2 max and below or really hard, well, then 3 zones might be sufficient because it serves the needs of your, I'll call it, bias as to how people should train. I was trying to develop something that was flexible enough that it could be used by any coach, regardless of their philosophy about how people should train. I was trying to be agnostic with respect to training philosophy, and also trying to think about, well, how complex can it be? How simple should it be? And ultimately, I decided 7 was the magic number.
It's a prime number, by the way.
I could have been right. I could have been wrong, but that's what I settled on because it seemed to me that was the minimum number that was needed to really capture the way people actually do train, and that you could then classify various workouts, and they would all or almost all fall into one of these 7 levels.
I mean, you mentioned Dr. Seiler's 3 zones and the polarized approach, and we've brought that up a lot. And the one thing I did like about his 3 zones is it is purely based on physiology. Basically, he said there are 2 thresholds, so that defines 3 zones. Now, we had him on the show, and he did say that's all based on oxygen consumption, and you max out at VO2 max. So when you're dealing with heart rate or VO2, there's nothing above VO2 max. So he said there's actually really kind of 4 zones, even on that simple model, because when you're dealing with something like power, there are intensities above VO2 max. But you're taking it a step further, and it sounds like you're saying this is a combination of both looking at physiology and looking at the way people train. And so you have, I'm looking at your classic levels, and I love that you didn't just call them zones or levels, you gave them names. But you have active recovery, endurance, tempo, lactate threshold, VO2 max, anaerobic capacity, and neuromuscular power. Do you want to talk a little bit, and maybe this is too big a question, but do you want to talk a little bit about why those distinctions and those terms?
Yeah, I think it was useful to have names along with numbers because it aided in communication. Why are you training at this intensity? What is your goal here? What are you trying to achieve? Are you exercising at a relatively low intensity because it's part of active recovery, either recovering from interval workout or it's a recovery session, the day after a hard race? Are you training at an intensity where you're attempting to increase your VO2 max? Are you doing sprints to try and increase your neuromuscular power? And then the one that ends up being like, what do you call it, is a little bit into Steve Seiler, also a University of Texas at Austin grad, by the way, which is like, well, what do you call level 3? Well, now it's tempo or fartlek, which is really almost borrowing from the running world kind of thing. But again, it was trying to be able to communicate with people. If somebody says go off and do intervals at this power output because it's level 4 for you, what am I trying to achieve here? Well, okay, we're attempting to improve your muscular metabolic fitness, aka your lactate threshold, aka whatever you want to call it. I do have to push back though. I disagree with the claim that a 3-zone system is entirely grounded in physiology. If you actually go back in the literature, I mean, the whole notion of a lactate threshold is as arbitrary as the notion of training levels or training zones, because the blood lactate response to exercise occurs on a continuum. It's a mental convenience to come along and say, oh, here's a break point, because it sums up everything about a person in a single number. Their lactate threshold is at 97% of VO2 max. And I can say that, and Steve, as an exercise physiologist, is raising his eyebrows, because that one number is so high that he's going, doesn't sound kosher, right? But in point of fact, if I wanted to fully convey the information about that individual to another scientist, I would present a graph of their blood lactate response against their exercise intensity. And you have to look at all the points on the curve. So the notion of lactate threshold is really a mental convenience. The notion of zones or levels is a mental convenience, because our brains have a hard time dealing with the complexity all at once. So if you go back in the literature, what you find is there's a very close correlation between the exercise intensity across individuals. The exercise intensity that elicits a blood lactate concentration of 4 millimoles per liter OBLA will correlate with the exercise intensity that elicits a blood lactate concentration of 2.5 millimoles, or 3, or 6, or whatever. To say that there are two thresholds, it's a mental convenience. Everything's on a continuum, and the effect of endurance exercise training is to shift that entire curve around.
So I actually love hearing you say that. I'm looking right now at a review that I grabbed just for this conversation that was written by Drs. Faude and Meyer in 2009. It's titled Lactate Threshold Concepts. And they actually, even though they detail this 2 breakpoint model in this review, I have in big and bold a part in the study where they say that it's an old model, this idea of a shift from aerobic to anaerobic metabolism. And they even say, and here's what I have in bold, it's a transition. So the term threshold may be misleading, which is exactly what you're saying.
And not only that, so if I can interject real quick, if we back up, again, I'm not sure how old you guys are, but having been around for a while, there was a huge dilemma we'll say at the turn of the century, if you will. That hurts me to say that, but that the nomenclature and the definition of the threshold, and I can't even remember if I got it in the book. I made an allusion to this in the book when we were writing it, because I make this point all the time. There's a review paper I use in class when I teach at the graduate level. That's a review paper from the early 2000s that talks about the scientific definitions for threshold. And at that time, there were 30 plus scientifically validated definitions for a threshold, right? And if I had somebody come into my lab and say, and I have this all the time, people come in and say, I want my lactate threshold test. Which one do you want? Oh, well, what do you mean? What do I want? I want my lactate threshold. Well, as Andy alluded to, there's a zillion different definitions of the threshold, and I can give you one, but it's going to be different when you go down to the street to another lab, right? So the problem has always been the notion that there is this magical quote unquote threshold that defines some things and is magical at above and below. And one of the real values, I think, that Andy contributed, aside from some other stuff in the system that he developed, is the notion of the functional threshold, which there's really not a lot of debate about and it's really become pretty standard in the nomenclature in training science, that not only training science, but in practical training as well. When you go on a ride with somebody and you talk about a threshold, again, if you're talking about a threshold 10, 20 years ago, who knows what you're talking about? Right now, everybody pretty much knows what you're talking about when you talk about your functional threshold, right? And it's standardized some definitions in training science, which is real problematic. 20 years ago, we used to talk about this, the problem with using lactate threshold as a definitional term, because there was no consensus on what it was. Right. The functional threshold has become much more standardized and is much more readily available to use as, again, a standard metric as a point of reference.
I was going to say, that's one of the points back when I used to do what Steve does now, and that is tour around and, give the exercise phys lectures for the coaching certification program. One of the points I always made was that really coaches don't have to know that much about exercise physiology. If you want to go off and break new ground, if you want to be in the position to evaluate, off the wall ideas, yes, it is very helpful to have a background in that area. But a coach wears so many hats. And someone could be a phenomenal coach because they're a great motivator, or they're great organizational skills, or they're a great tactician, or they can teach bike handling, or whatever of the many aspects that contribute to performance. And they could have a straight up undergraduate, black and white. They think they understand exercise physiology, stick to the tried and true, and be extremely successful. So you really don't have to know that much about human physiology. And in point of fact, trying to understand it is where the problem arises, because the applied world gets so confused, where you have people talk about my lactate threshold is 140 beats per minute. It's like, that's not possible, right? So the idea of functional threshold power was to try and cut through all of that noise and say, forget about lactate. You don't need to think about lactate. You don't need to think about the physiology. We all know that there's a certain exercise intensity that we can maintain for a pretty long time. And if we go a little bit too hard, we realize that the gorilla is going to jump on our back sooner rather than later. And if we go well above that intensity, the gorilla is going to jump on our back even sooner. I mean, how else do athletes figure out how to pace themselves in time trials, right? They don't do that because they understand exercise physiology. They're responding to their own sensations. So the idea of functional threshold power was just to embrace that and say, forget about lactate, forget about the physiological responses. Let's just focus on what we're measuring, power output, and relate it to something that is intuitively obvious to the individual.
And I like hearing you say that, because we actually talked about that with time trialists, that very good time trialists, they don't need a number. They know the feel. And they can sit there right at that functional threshold, even if they didn't have a single screen to look at.
Yeah, just came out where they had cyclists do 30-minute time trials and in a lab. So I don't know if that's my deadly sin number 6 or deadly sin number 7, depending on how motivated you think they were in a lab environment, et cetera. But it was a better estimate of maximal lactate steady state power than critical power testing was. Which just reinforces, it's like, let's just trust the athlete and their sensations and, leverage the practicality of, now I can measure my power in the real world and come up with a way of utilizing that data and leave the lab behind. But
I will say, I'm glad I was reading your explanation of FTP in your new book last night and really liked some of the things you addressed that unfortunately, people have associated FTP too much with 1 hour power, and that it's more complex than that. And just my personal bias, I think it's very important for people to come up with an accurate FTP, because I can't tell you how many athletes I've seen do a 20-minute test or look back for their best 20-minute power in the last 2 years and say, oh, that's my FTP, because I really like that number. And then they're unable to do any of their interval work because they're nowhere close to that number. And plus, as you pointed out, 20-minute power is not FTP.
Tim Cusick had a name for that, vanity FTP.
Yes, thank you.
People are always going to pick the number that flatters them the most. And in fact, I will say that back when I was fit and racing, I would say my FTP was 300 watts, when in fact, the best I ever averaged in a 40K was 298. So even the inventor of FTP is taking liberties and rounding up. But it is to the nearest 5 watts, which again is one of the points I always tell people. It's like when they say that their FTP is 281.16257 watts. No. It just makes me roll my eye. We have variability in human performance. I always tell people it's the nearest 5 watts is as close as you can get.
And there's also the measuring error in the power meters themselves.
Yeah.
I had this unfortunate conversation with an athlete who was trying to convince me his FTP was 260 and was asking me, he was doing 5-minute intervals and asking me why he wasn't getting through them. And I'm sitting there trying to explain to him, that's because your FTP isn't 260. And he was just insistent, yes, it is. And I went, what's the definition of FTP? And he goes, it's the power you can do for 1 hour. I'm like, can you do 5 minutes at that power? No. Then that's not your FTP. Yes, it is.
Yeah, there's a big leap between 5 minutes and
yes.
About an hour.
A little.
It probably wouldn't be fair if we didn't give Dr. Seiler a chance to give his take on zones. While he does focus on the physiology, you may be surprised by his rationale for starting with a 3-zone model.
I think we want to achieve the same thing. My goal every time I talk on these podcasts, obviously it's not to enhance my research career. It's to, because I think it's worthwhile to try to put this research into practice and help people avoid making mistakes. And I think the most, risk, if you talk to engineers about risk assessment, they say risk is equal to probability times, consequence. They say risk is equal to probability times consequence. So you can have a very low probability, but if the consequences are very high, then it still may be an unacceptable risk. Have you heard this terminology?
Yeah, no, I have. Interesting.
So, and in my way of thinking, this is kind of where we are with training. Is okay. I want to try to help people avoid these situations that have kind of high probability of happening and fairly significant consequences. And the most common, the most high probability for endurance athletes is not that they train too hard on the hard days. It's that they train too hard on the easy days. And and we've talked about this a bunch of times. And this is where the zones come into play. And I don't really care how you calculate the zones, if as long as as we ultimately achieve that distribution that we've been talking about. And so what the answer I want to give to you is basically the power zones are fine as long as they're anchored in physiology. And certainly you and I know, and we know that there are not 9 distinct zones, like as Coggan and as Hunter Allen are saying, it overlaps. But if we're going to be able to use these, we have to have some kind of anchoring to physiological markers, to something that that makes sense physiologically. And if we do that, then everybody can roughly speak the same language. But if we don't, or if things slide out of control, and that's my big concern with FTP, is that depending on how it is tested, it can be, the typical error, as you know, is that it tends to be overestimated.
Right.
And then if it gets overestimated, it will tend to have downstream effects on all of these zones that are calculated. And then that will have long-term effects on the whole training process for people. So that is my concern. I love power measurements. It's a wonderful tool. And as long as we can calibrate it, then I'm all for it. I mean, I almost can't get off my Zwift bike because I want to have power all the time, and I don't have power on my outdoor bikes yet. So I get it. I'm just concerned that we throw out the physiological baby with the bathwater here.
Yeah. So if I understand you correctly, your reasoning for proposing this 3-zone model was it was a very simple model based on physiology. You're not saying that we should necessarily stick with just those 3 zones. You can have a 5 or a 6 or a 7-zone model, but stay grounded on that physiology.
Yeah, and perhaps build it up step by step, because a lot of the athletes that I meet, they are just, these amateurs, they are out of control. They don't really have any kind of intensity zone control. So I would want to start simple with them and say, all right, well, let's learn how to think green, yellow, red. Let's learn how to really be consistent, that low intensity sessions stay low intensity, that you don't let them slide out of control. And then as they get control of that, and the 3-zone model is something that they can use effectively, then we can start to be a bit more nuanced in, where within zone 1 do we want to do our bread and butter low intensity work? Where within zone 3 do we want to try to accumulate minutes? That's for me the next step, if that makes sense.
Yep. Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And that might be where some of these models like what Hunter and Dr. Coggan come up with.
Right. So again, and that's what I want to, saying I'm not trying to say they're wrong. I'm just saying it may be that go on the way there, ultimately, if that's the ultimate goal, is to be very sophisticated and have really good control of these zones, that we may have to start with fewer zones and then learn our way up. Because I find that a lot of what these endurance athletes need is just education and discipline. They have to feel it and develop the discipline and know where they're at and how to stay there, or how to avoid drifting upward, during sessions. How to avoid getting pulled into a threshold workout when their intention was to stay low and easy for 3 hours. No, so that's my answer, to your question, in terms of I don't think there's right versus wrong. I just think that we have to maybe sometimes use a progression based on a learning process, and that's point one. And then of course point two is that those power zones are fundamentally connected to some physiology, and so we need to kind of make sure that lines up the way we expect it to, and then we have to be able to teach it correctly. Andy and I actually did our PhDs at the same university.
Really?
He was a few years ahead of me. So what's kind of fun is that, back in the day, the hour of power was this term that these guys at the University of Texas used a lot. It was Ed Coyle and Andy Coggan, and that was one of their big studies, was a 60-minute test. I think you can basically say that a lot of Andy's ideas around the functional threshold came from there. It was the 60-minute trial.
And that was your school as well?
Yeah, I mean, it was the same place. He was from the same place. He did a lot of work with a guy named Ed Coyle. Yep. I'm sure you've read some of his stuff on different things. And so I came in a few years after he finished. But everyone knew, because Ed would teach the physiology courses and talk about some of those studies that Coggan had been involved in. And then Ed kind of moved into carbohydrate metabolism was one of his big things. But yeah, so that whole group, I was really pumping out a lot of stuff. But the hour of power, just that term, I can remember us talking about that, particular term. And then a bit later came maximum lactate steady state. And, so it kind of all morphed into it together on some, in different ways.
Dr. Seiler did mention that we should start simple, and then as we understand training better, we could look for the subtleties. So let's get back to the conversation and talk about how in some ways Dr. Coggan's classic zones are just finding that subtlety based on a combination of physiology and how riders train. We're going to get into eye levels in a minute, but talking about your first 4 levels, even your classics. We had just talked about perhaps that 3-zone model of Dr. Seiler's is a little simplistic, but I actually personally feel there's a lot of similarities here. I think even Dr. Seiler would say, when you talk about training below that aerobic threshold, or the way he measures that point where your lactates start to click up, it's not all the same. If you're training right at or right near that aerobic threshold, that's very different from just noodling at 100 watts. And so I look at, you have active recovery and you have endurance. That would be Seiler's zone 1, but active recovery is just really slow and easy, where endurance is pushing yourself a little bit right near what Seiler would call that first threshold. And again, you have it as a level or a range, going back to your point of it's not a point. It's not a very specific this wattage or this heart rate. That there's that general range that we know that it's very good to train at, where you're pushing that aerobic threshold. And then and you can please tear me apart after I say all this, but your tempo is very similar to his zone 2. And then again, you have a lactate threshold range that goes to your point of there's a lot of different thresholds that vary. But we know that training somewhere in that range can be very beneficial. So you have a lactate threshold range that would be, kind of the high end of Seiler's zone 2 and the low end of his zone 3. So I like that it's still based on some of the same physiology, but you address the issues of threshold is not a point, and zone 1 and these various zones probably need a little more distinction.
They certainly do if you want to have a system that's agnostic to training philosophy. Whereas if you are a firm believer in polarized training, then it's sufficient to say, well, we have a 3-zone system, and then you just tell your athletes today you're going to go do zone 1 training, and they know to work toward the upper part of that. right? But that 3-zone system doesn't work then if you had a mythical coach. And I say mythical because I don't know of anyone who adheres to it, but they put up the straw man, threshold training model, right? How does somebody whose training philosophy diverges markedly from the polarized idea apply a 3-zone system? Does it actually meet their needs? So I think that, there is a difference in what, actually it's not Steve's 3-zone system, it's the Norwegian way or whatever. But there's a difference between 3-zone and polarized, which are wedded together, and my training levels, which are at least an attempt to be agnostic to training philosophy. A coach could use my training levels and prescribe only zone 2. See, now you have me saying zone.
Sorry.
Prescribe only level 2 and only level 5 workouts, right? And be doing polarized training. But you're not using a 3-zone system. You're using my original 7 levels or whatever, which actually comes back to, distinguishing between there's the system you use to describe and prescribe the training, and then there's the actual training plan. You can do nothing but level 2 and level 5, and you're not doing polarized training, because I've done it alternating. So instead of a 80-20 ratio, I'm doing a 50-50 ratio. So I trademarked that as bimodal training. So down to you have a system that describes and used for prescription, and then here's the actual prescription. How many workouts do you do at a particular intensity? How long are those workouts? How are they sequenced within a week and within a month and within a year? And then this, I now defer to experts like Hunter and Steve who actually coach people, because I don't coach. I've never been a coach, never wanted to be a coach. All I was trying to do is put out a tool that would be flexible enough to serve the needs of all of the people out there.
Today's episode of Fast Talk is brought to you by Whoop, a performance tool that is changing the way people track their fitness and optimize their training. Whoop provides a wrist-worn heart rate monitor that pairs to their app that provides analytics and insights on recovery, strain, and sleep. Know when your body is recovered or when it needs rest by getting to know your nervous system through heart rate variability and quality of sleep. Automatically track workouts and get strain scores that let you know how strenuous training was on your body, and see even more data like average heart rate, max heart rate, and calories burned. Get optimal sleep times based on how strenuous your day was, and track sleep performance with insight into your sleep cycles and stages of sleep, sleep quality, and sleep consistency. I can tell you, by having worn a Whoop myself, that it provides fascinating data and can optimize the way you train, recover, and perform. And the sleep stuff is incredible. Whoop has provided an offer for Fast Talk listeners to get 15% off their purchase with the code FASTTALK. Just go to whoop.com, that's WHOOP.com, and use the code FASTTALK at checkout to save 15% and optimize the way you train.
So I think what we're going to cover next is just talking a little bit about some of the issues with the standard zone models that I think we all share. And I think that will then take us really well into talking about your eye levels, which I felt very elegantly addresses some of these issues, which is why I think we need to quickly discuss the issues. And if you don't mind, I'm going to quickly start with one of my biggest pet peeves is when I'm out on a ride with somebody and they say, oh, I'm doing a zone 2 ride. Whenever somebody says that to me, I go, what does that mean? And they turn around to me and go, well, you're a coach. You know what that means, right? And I go, well, I've read what the explanation is behind it. But my question is, you're the one doing the ride. Do you understand the purpose of that ride? And what I find is when people talk about zones, they don't really understand what they're trying to accomplish. So that's one of the reasons I love that even in your classic zones, you give it all names that helps people to understand the purpose. But I quickly, just to give you an idea, before this podcast, I took a bunch of the classic zone systems and took the zone 2 and put the heart rate ranges, because a lot of the zone models only give heart rate. And just to give you an idea, US Cycling, their zone 2 is 114 to 126 beats per minute. The British Federation is 121 to 140. And then at the top end, we have Joe Friel's system, which is 141 to 153. So USA Cycling Zone 2 and Joe Friel's Zone 2, there's a 15 beat per minute difference between the top of the one and the bottom of the other. And I'm not saying either one is wrong. It's just if two guys are going out and doing a Zone 2 ride and they're using different models and they don't know it, they're doing very different things.
Yeah, which comes back to power-based training, not heart rate-based training, but even whatever your metric is, it comes back to having a systematic approach. I periodically see people who want to, follow the training program of X using, the zones of Coach Y, and that kind of mixing and matching never works. So maybe this is a point I would actually bring Hunter back into the conversation before he falls asleep. What guidance do you give to your athletes if you tell them, go out and do a level 2 ride?
Well, I mean, from that perspective, I mean, the goal of that ride is to improve their endurance and stamina. So, I very rarely actually prescribe just go ride for 5 hours at level 2. I think it's kind of boring, and the athletes, unless they're a pro athlete, they find it is boring, and even the pros do. So what I'll say is, okay, hey, I want you to go and ride in between 2 and 3, and you need to do 4 or 5 hours, because otherwise you're not actually improving your endurance and your stamina, and that's really the ultimate goal. My big thing is I see people who are doing level 2 rides and they're not riding long enough. It's like, oh, okay, well, I'm going to go do a level 2 ride for 2 hours. It's like, well, wait a minute. That's not going to do it's not any kind of overload at all. And they're not really going to improve their endurance for 2 hours. The same kind of thing happens with, one of my concerns always is these athletes who are, not riding easy enough in their rest days. I mean, you use your power meter as a governor in a rest day. It's like, okay, stay underneath 56% of your FTP and don't go more than an hour and a half. It's like, well, gosh, if you're riding 3 hours or 4 hours underneath 56% of your FTP, that's not a rest day. That's a lot of time on the saddle. So,
and I love that you address that in the book when you bring up the question of, is there a no man's land? You said no man's land is not an intensity. Any intensity can be appropriate. It's the combination. So you use the example, exactly that example of just because you're riding in the active recovery range or level, if you're going out and doing 4 hours, that's not a recovery ride.
Yep, exactly. Yep, exactly. And so I think that's where you have to come back, and that's why I love these Coggan classic levels, and we're looking at a particular what's our purpose, and that's why they're so easy to explain. What's the purpose of doing this, and then make sure we adhere to a few principles around it that allow us to address that purpose.
We hope by now you see that using a zone model, any zone model, has its limitations. There are issues with what the zones are based on, whether you can truly say a zone system is physiological, how they are used, and so on. We asked Sebastian Weber, who coaches athletes like world champion Tony Martin, and is the mind behind INSCYD, about basing zones on FTP versus VO2 max. But as the conversation progressed, Sebastian really hammered home that all zone models are rough and have their issues.
Basing zones as a percentage of FTP, I mean, that's kind of the classic approach. I mean, take FTP as a substitute for any kind of lactate anaerobic threshold whatsoever. If you go 40 years back in history of sports science or training science, everything was based on some kind of percentage above or below a certain kind of threshold concept. So that's a pretty classic approach, so to speak. It's a quite okay to do concept, I would say, because it gives you some kind of approximate idea on the intensity. Going back to what you said, having a zone based on VO2 max or something, VO2 max is a classic example, because if you think about basing training intensity on a VO2 max, this is what you will find on almost every scientific paper, right? Almost every scientific paper which is dealing with exercise training, adaptation to a certain training stimulus or whatsoever, intensity is always described, or most times described, as percentage of VO2 max. And why this might be a better concept, partly, is that if you're trying to increase your aerobic capacity, or more precise aerobic power or performance, you're talking about increasing VO2 max.
Well, so it was interesting because, Dr. Coggan, when he came up with zones based on FTP, he addressed that and said, your VO2 max is relatively set. What's important to know is what percentage of your VO2 max you can sustain, which is different for everybody. So he says here, this is because although an athlete's cardiovascular fitness, that is his or her maximal oxygen uptake, or VO2 max, sets the upper limit to his or her rate of aerobic energy production, it is the individual's metabolic fitness or lactate threshold that determines the percentage or fraction of this VO2 max that can be utilized for any given period of time. So that's his argument for why zones should be based off of threshold versus VO2 max.
Well, so he's not saying, basically here, it's not saying that the VO2 max is fixed. This is why I've asked. This would have quite surprised me. No, so that's kind of the dilemma here, so to speak, right? The dilemma we are looking at here is that for a practical application, if you base things off FTP, you get an idea on how long you might be able to sustain that. Even though I think this is a very, very rough way to do it, or maybe not the best way to do it. So from a practical application point of view, writing things into a training program in terms of how long do you ride, how long do you exercise in a certain intensity, basing things off a threshold model. Yeah, again, it's a classic approach and it's a valid way to do it. The problem, though, is that if you only know your threshold, you have no idea on which percentage of VO2 max you're exercising. And the most common problem you run into here is what people call, when you do trainings, like what people call VO2 max intervals, right? I think there's this common sense that, some 3, 4, 5, whatsoever minutes intervals. And then people base this off percentage of FTP. And you can open up these training textbooks and it say, I don't know what, 115 to 125% of FTP. And the problem here obviously is that if you base everything off FTP, and you go, let's do a VO2 max interval, and let's, for everybody, one size fits all, 100% of FTP. One athlete might be somewhere in the ballpark of 105% of VO2 max, and another athlete might be in the ballpark of somewhere like 85% VO2 max or something, roughly, right? If you base it off FTP, you have no idea on which, how much you're actually triggering or loading the system if you want to take it this way. And then let me comment really quick on the idea that FTP or any other threshold concept, any percentage, is a good way to use this for training zones, because it informs you about how long somebody can sustain an effort. I'm not so happy with that, actually, because also your fat max zone, or also your carbohydrate combustion, which is really the bottleneck when it comes to the question how long you can sustain a sub-threshold effort.
Yep.
If you assume good hydration and stuff, then the bottleneck is really the carbohydrate combustion. And there is absolutely no quantitative proportional correlation or link between your threshold power or percentage of threshold power and how much carbohydrate somebody is using. So there it falls short again. So it falls short in terms of you don't know how much you load your aerobic system, and you don't really know subthreshold how long you can sustain it, because you don't know your substrate utilization. So again, it's a 40, 50-year-old concept, and it has a right to exist, but it's a very rough way to do things.
It sounds like you're saying you don't like zones because there really is no ideal way. Every athlete's unique, and you just need to understand their physiology and then say, we want to work this side of your physiology, so I'm going to give you a specific workout with specific targets to work that side. And to just give you zones and say, if you're in this zone, you're training this system, is overly simplistic.
Right, and let me give you this. let me give you one practical example, which is a common issue, at least for triathletes and cyclists in Europe. Take your weekend warrior age group rider, for example, right? Who maybe trains whatever 3-4 hours in whatever you want to call this base zone, long, slow distance. So this is your longer ride of the week. It's no problem for the intensity of this kind of training to use whatever 70% of FTP. 65 to 75% of FTP is like the common recommendation, right? And this works. The problem is now, again, pretty common over in Europe, then this kind of athlete goes to a training camp. They go to Mallorca, they go to Spain, they go to Italy for 2 weeks, and they are riding every day like 5 hours because they can. They have the time to do that. Now, the same intensity doesn't work anymore. It is per definition zone whatsoever. I even have no clue what the number of this zone is. When they're now riding 5 hours average a day or whatever, even if
Right.
with a group ride and stick to that zone, they're blowing up after 3 or 4 days. Because the energy expenditure at this intensity is too high to be sustained for day in, day out, 4 or 5 hours riding. And where this also falls short, when you turn to the professionals. And here's my prime example. You take, again, let's say 70% of FTP as your base training, long, slow distance training zone, right? And let's say you have a 75 kilogram amateur rider, whatever threshold, 300 watts, let's say 70%, which means that his base training zone is 210 watts. That's a nice pace, that's a nice speed normally, and it's easy. Shouldn't be a problem to do this for 3-4 hours. Now you take the same concept of a training zone and go to any WorldTour team, take a WorldTour rider and apply the same concept. And here's my example. Let's apply this to Tony Martin. He is approximately 75 kilograms. His threshold is way above 400 watts.
Yep.
70% of the threshold of like 430, 440 watts. This is about 300 watts. Now you go to Tony Martin and tell him to ride 5-6 hours, 300 watts. I tell you, Paris-Roubaix is approximately 6 hours, 300 watts.
Right.
Right? If you do this, everybody will laugh at you, will just kick you out. It's not working. And this is because it's a rough estimation, and it doesn't tell you, the percentage doesn't tell you that the carbohydrate, for example, the carbohydrate expenditure utilization at 70% of threshold is way too high for people to sustain that. And just one quick comment on that. Historically, these percentage zones come from lactate profile, lactate threshold testing, and those origined in running. So something like a 4 millimole threshold, this is 42 years ago this year, and taking a percentage of 4 millimole was used in runners. And they run 2 hours per day, maybe 2.5 or 3, right? So it's not a problem. And then, for example, what happened in Germany is they were trying to apply it in the early 80s to cyclists, and everybody blew up. And you know what they did? They didn't, funnily, at this time, they didn't change the zone. They didn't say, oh, let's not do 70%, let's do 55% or something. No, they just lowered the lactate value for their threshold and stick to 70%. But the result, no, it's true. It's true. They said, okay, it's not working, so let's stick with 70%, but let's take 3 millimoles instead, or resting lactate plus 1.5 or something. But anyway, it was a proof that it didn't work. It didn't work for 5-6 hour rides, right?
Let's give Dr. Coggan the final word on VO2 max versus FTP, and then talk about his eye levels, which try to address some of the concerns that Sebastian raised.
You had discussed referencing threshold instead of VO2 max. And your question was, what defines a good system? I think it's been crystal clear since the 70s and certainly by the 80s that it's muscular metabolic fitness and not VO2 max that's the most important determinant, and therefore it makes the most logical sense. We actually did a study when I was a PhD student with 14 cyclists, all with the same VO2 max, but with a 6-fold range in how long they could maintain 88% of VO2 max, which then linked back to their blood lactate response to exercise, which is an indirect indicator of the rate at which they're using muscle glycogen. That was the one thing that was interesting to me as a physiologist, is the fact that, as I described at one time, there isn't a unique fingerprint of VO2 max on the exercise intensity duration relationship. I mean, yeah, we can estimate VO2 max and WKO4 with reasonable precision, but it requires certain assumptions to be made, because it's not like it just jumps out that, oh, look, after 5 minutes you fall off, right? And yet we always say, well, VO2 max is such an important determinant of, exercise responses, et cetera, that if you want to have be an elite athlete, you need to have a sufficiently high VO2 max. I mean, we know it's critical. It sets the upper limit for aerobic ATP production. And yet it doesn't have a uniquely identifiable signature on the exercise intensity duration relationship.
I think you made this point, but I agree with this 100%, that we put a big focus on VO2 max because it's so heavily tested in research and in the labs. But once you get out into the field and into races, it's rarely a major factor in racing.
Yeah. Well, of course, you could also say that about almost all the physiology, right?
Fair enough.
I mean, it's how much power you produce and, when you apply it tactically and who's first across the finish line, and who cares about the exercise science. Geeks like us to come along after the fact and try and understand things, but the racers don't care, nor do they necessarily need to care.
Well, I don't know. Exercise science tells me that if I'm racing with Connor, I want to get in a breakaway with him. As long as I can hold on to Andy's wheel, I want to get in a breakaway with him too. So.
Yeah, I don't know if this is in any of the science, but if there's a measure for big dumb horse that takes people to the finish line and gets his butt kicked, my rating on that is amazing. So let's kind of dive into your eye levels and start with one of the things you address that I think is the other big issue with zones is people get this notion into their head that as soon as you go 2 watts, you change your power from 230 watts to 235 watts, which takes you from endurance to tempo, that all of a sudden you're training a different system. And I will tell you, I actually got into this email debate with a listener who got quite upset because one of our previous guests suggested training at 97% of threshold. And that's not threshold anymore because you're at 97%. And how could you suggest that?
Well, it's
that's
not.
Sweet spot training. And I like the fact that in your eye levels, you said it's not like you suddenly go from 290 to 291 and you're training different energy systems, that it's a continuum. So maybe we start there.
Well, yeah, it comes back to it's a continuum. What is the magic number of subdivisions that is not too many as to be unwieldy, but is enough to at least try and pay lip service to the actual complexity? My original answer was 7. The original levels work great from FTP and on down because at those intensities, it is muscular metabolic fitness that is the primary determinant of performance. Once you go at higher intensities, now other factors begin to play a role. And while we can say that on average, 120% of FTP would correspond to VO2 max, or near enough that if you train at 120% of FTP, you're targeting your VO2 max. There are individuals whose suprathreshold ability is exceptional, and those are the people who can tolerate and knock out the intervals at 150%. Or conversely, you can get the diesels, the triathletes, who they never train above FTP. And when you ask them to do so, they're very limited and they struggle to do even, say 6 by 5 minutes at 110%. So it was the suprathreshold variability between individuals that the eye levels were intended to address. And they leverage the power duration model in proprietary ways to try and target specific responses and hence adaptations. I personally have a bit of concern even with the eye levels in that it's getting rather unwieldy because how many are there now? 13?
No, I think 9.
9?
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9.
Prime number.
Yeah.
9.
There's 9. And one of those is Hunter's fault because Sweet Spot is now a formal level to serve the needs of coaches. And in fact, I remember having that conversation as we were boarding a train in Boston where Hunter was lobbying for a Sweet Spot level. This is back in the original levels day. And I'm telling Hunter, look, there's no reason that you can't prescribe your athletes to train at what you think of as sweet spot. We don't need a formal level, but he finally got his way.
It took 10 plus years.
Yeah. I mean, 9's getting up there. It's getting pretty complicated.
Well, and the other point about that too is that I think the whole notion or the whole kind of theme behind this podcast was the strengths and or weaknesses of zone approach, right? And I think that gets to the point when the
Right.
inventor of the levels doesn't even know how many levels there are. I think that kind of attributes the magnitude of importance he ascribes to the actual levels themselves. Again, it's a practical convention to convey notions that are more standardized, but everything happens on a continuum. And whether it's 9 or 15 or 3 is just a practical consideration more than anything else. And yeah, it's getting to be a lot, isn't it?
But I do like the fact that you kept names and you can look at the titles and understand what is it that I'm trying to train here. So, your level 4 is FTP, and that's really focusing on your threshold strength. Level 5, you basically say now you're high enough above FTP that you're improving both your functional reserve capacity, but you're still also working your FTP power. So you can look at these, and yeah, if you look at the numbers, it gets unwieldy. But if you look at the names, you can really understand this is what I'm trying to train. This is what I'm trying to focus on.
Yep, agreed. And back to that, back to my original point. Why do we have these things? Because it really gives clarity. It helps us as coaches and also as athletes to, again, quantify when we're there, when we're in the right area of training to train that specific system. And it's before, right, we didn't know, right? We had heart rate and rate of perceived exertion, and wow, gosh, if you just went by heart rate, well, maybe you didn't sleep that well last night, or you had a glass of wine, or maybe you had 4 cups of coffee. And so you think that you're in the right area based on your heart rate. But we didn't really know. Were you truly training your VO2 max? And maybe you weren't. Maybe you were training still your FTP. And so I think that's where having these things really help us to understand, okay, and quantify. This is the right place for you to train based on whatever your training plan, your coach says, whatever your goal itself, the purpose.
We actually had a 5-minute segment at this point in the show where Dr. Coggan explained the math behind eye levels and the limitations of the model. But in that explanation, he simultaneously showed just how smart he is. It also put all of my dirt bombs to shame. Thankfully, when we had Colby on the show, he gave us a great summary. So the next one, we just did a podcast yesterday with Hunter Allen, Dr. Coggan, and Dr. Steve McGregor.
Oh, wow.
It was
That's
fun.
a good one.
It was a good one.
I'll have to listen
get
to
a
it.
ball because they're coming out with power training and racing with a power meter. The 3rd edition is coming out, so
Okay.
we're able to.
Cool.
So we
Great.
talked with them about training zones, and they, like me, are not big fans of the term zones, so they use their levels.
Right.
But wanted to, get your opinion overall about zones, but in particular, are you familiar with their eye levels?
Yes.
And what your thoughts are there?
So, addressing eye levels first, I've used them with a lot of my athletes, or rather I've seen if there was a correlation between my athletes, the ability for them to make power for the given predicted durations of the eye levels. And the short answer is, in some cases, yes, there's a very good correlation. In some cases, it's pretty poor. To be fair, the athletes in which it doesn't really predict their eye levels accurately are athletes that are sort of off of Coggan's, I'll say, spectrum. And he looks at things from a very threshold heavy or FTP standard perspective. And these are athletes who are more track focused. Granted, they're endurance track athletes, not pure sprinters, but still. So there should be some crossover. And there are a few other little particularities to these cases, but I think it illustrates the point. And I'm pretty sure Andy said this himself. All mathematical models are invalid over a large enough domain. The question is, what is their domain of validity? I'm pretty sure that's more or less a direct quote of Andy. So what he's saying is, when we make a mathematical model of someone's power zones or predict what power they're going to get benefit from over a certain duration, which is what the eye levels are, then that's a model. And in some cases, that model might work, and it might work really well for the bell curve of athletes, but inevitably we'll find athletes that fall outside that curve. So just like any model these guys are using, whether it's the PMC, which is the mother of all models, or eye levels, you have to look at those models with a bit of skepticism, and you have to understand what exactly are you modeling? What are the limits of that model? What are the limits of the domain?
Back to the show. So the other thing, maybe we need to give a quick explanation of the power duration curve. But the other thing I find really interesting about this is a lot of the older zone system, even your classic zone system, was based purely on percentages of FTP. With your eye levels, you are looking at somebody's individual power duration curve and coming up with these levels based on the shape of their curve, which gives a lot of individuality. Pretty much all modern training software has some variation on this power duration curve, but it's this nice smooth curve that starts, at the very short duration. So the 1 to 5 seconds, you have very high wattage. And then depending on the rider, somewhere around 5 to 10 seconds, it starts to decline quite rapidly until you get to about a couple minutes where you start plateauing at what is your FTP. And that's actually I know in WKO what they use to predict MFTP. And that stays somewhat level out until about 30 minutes to an hour and then starts to decline again. And everybody has and I'm just, sorry, this is all yours. I'm just kind of summarizing what you had, what you explained very well in the book. Everybody has a very unique shape to their curve. So I'm a time trialer, which means my 1 to 5 second power is pretty bad and I don't have that steep a decline. Where a sprinter would have a very, very high 1 to 5 second power, but then decline quite rapidly. And so everybody's unique. And what I found absolutely fascinating is with your eye levels, the way you're figuring out your levels is looking at the deflection points in that curve, which is unique to each individual. Is that an accurate summary of it?
That's an accurate description, yes. It is very... I would say pragmatically based, although I don't know if doing nonlinear least squares curve fitting with a custom built solver is pragmatic. But even the terminology, functional reserve capacity. Well, if we're going to talk about a functional threshold power, well, functionally, we don't need to worry about what the physiology is behind it. It's just that when you go above threshold, the duration you can maintain it becomes progressively more limited, and we can mathematically pretend that it's a gas tank, it's a capacity, right? It may not actually be, but nonetheless, the mathematical model describes it pretty well. So we treat it that way. One of the things I picked up along the way from doing mathematical modeling with stable isotopic tracer stuff, is that, mathematical models are theoretical constructs that may or may not have a basis in reality. It's a mathematical model. It provides a very good description of the power duration relationship, but that doesn't mean that it's reality, right?
Fair enough.
So you don't ever want to lose sight of that fact.
So then what are the benefits or advantages to basing your eye levels off of that modeled power duration curve?
It comes back to what you were describing the curve. The primary determinant of performance, primary physiological determinant of endurance exercise performance is muscular metabolic fitness. So if you take everybody's power duration relationship and you express their power as a percentage of FTP, what you find is people converge to a remarkable degree. I mean, yes, some people may differ in their stamina, and though they do a little bit better than somebody else over 5 hours, even though they might have the same FTP. Other people who don't have the same stamina may fade a little bit more. But from a 64,000 foot point of view, there's amazing similarity between individuals. And that's because the determinants of performance at 5 hours are very much the same determinants of performance at 1 hour, right?
Right.
But at the same time, you now move into the shorter durations, and now this is where you see people diverge. So as you move from below 5 minutes down to 2 minutes, down, as you were saying, 1 second or whatever. Now you can see remarkable differences where some people can only sprint at twice their sustainable power and other people can sprint at 12 times their sustainable power. So the eye levels are an attempt to target or reflect, I should say, the differences in performance ability at short durations. And it wasn't possible in the original levels to do that. And in fact, if you go back to the very origins of the first 7 levels, level 5 is 106 to 120% of FTP, and level 6 is 121% plus with no upper limit. And level 7 isn't referenced to FTP at all. It's just sprint all out, right?
Right.
So in terms of the range and power, level 6 and 7 are like, enormously wide. And so the eye levels were an attempt to try and narrow those and subdivide those. An example, my wife was a pursuiter. When she was training for the pursuit, she had phenomenal resistance to fatigue at, super threshold intensities. One of her coaches along the way gave us standardized workout, flying, rolling start, flying 2 kilometer repeats at race pace. Well, 2 kilometers only takes, 2 minutes and change. And because it was a flying start, there's no neuromuscular demand. It was the efforts were over before she really had depleted more than half of her FRC. They were too short to say that they were training VO2 max. I mean, it's like it was a no man's land for her in terms of a workout. So needless to say, she could do flying 2K repeats at race pace, year after year and not get any faster. Whereas for somebody else, a time trialist, to do a flying, 2K repeat at, your pursuit pace, if your pursuit is more aerobic, a minute and a half into it, you're hurting. And you are getting a physiological strain that's going to lead to adaptation. So again, this was the point of the upper eye levels, trying to take into consideration intra-individual differences in the shape of the power-duration relationship at supra-threshold intensities.
And going back to your point of you feel there might be too many zones, just train everybody to be like me, because I think my 5 through 7 are all the same, which is barely above threshold. Really simplifies it.
Well, and you might be, and you might be one of those people who the eye levels doesn't really matter for, right? You fit perfectly within the Coggan Classic levels, and so then it's like, well, just use those,
Or, it may also depend on one's competitive goals. If you were a triathlete, Ironman, you don't need to worry about anything above level 5. Not relevant to your chosen event.
Right.
Well, at the end of every show, we like to give our guests a chance to take all of their life's work and summarize it in 60 seconds. So let's start with you, Stephen. I know you need to jump off the call soon. What are your takeaways from this conversation today?
Takeaways from this conversation. Well, considering I've talked to these guys ad nauseum for about the past 25 years, not much, but I think the point is that people often use levels or zones, whatever you want to call them, and misunderstand them to be rigid constraints, when at least in this group of people, I know Andy and Hunter and myself, we think of them all collectively as guidelines and things to help clarify, as Hunter said, and target things, as opposed to rigid constraints for the most part.
Hunter, what do you think?
Well, again, kind of back to my point. I always have the coaching hat on because that's what I do, and I think that these training levels are really genius, and it's something that Andy, has incredible insight on, and they changed the world, right? They have actually changed the world of cycling in a large way. And so the profound nature of that is incredible, and it's allowed thousands of coaches to prescribe these, to describe these, to use them. It's allowed millions of athletes. Heck, I was in China in November, and I taught 4 different seminars, and for a month touring around China teaching training with power. And so there's a whole new millions of cyclists in China that are learning about training with power and understanding training levels. So I think that it's a great tool. It's a great tool for all of us to improve, because ultimately my job as a coach is I want my athletes to be successful. I want them to achieve their goals. And this is one of the tools that I use to help that and make that happen.
May I ask how many books did you get signed during this recording session?
Not enough.
Not enough. Only maybe 100.
Oh, okay. Andy, what would you say are the biggest takeaways that you'd like listeners to leave with today from this discussion?
And I started the clock, Andy, so let's see if you can do it.
I'm going to agree with Hunter that, yes, it's been great to put ideas out there and see what a large impact that they have had upon so many people, hopefully a beneficial impact. To the point, interestingly, that many people assume that I'm an applied sports scientist when in fact I'm somebody who chases NIH dollars doing exercise physiology, not sports science. But it's thanks to Hunter, looping me in, I've been able to give back to a sport that I was involved in before I was even involved in exercise physiology, and that I've loved for now 45 years. So I want to say that the take-home message here is I want to thank Hunter.
Oh,
I razz him a lot about, sucking me into this stuff. But if it weren't for him, I'd be, some old man off ranting on the internet.
Wait, you don't rant on the internet?
Not anymore. As Steve said, we've been knocking around together for about 25 years. So.
And Trevor, do you have any closing remarks?
I get to go last today. My closing remarks are mostly what they said. And just to remind our listeners, we are talking with the people who first figured out how to train with power, how to make those numbers valuable. And so many of these things that are just common language now, they weren't at one point common language. And you're talking with the people who came up with these concepts. So thank you for sharing with us. And the only thing I'm going to add to our particular conversation today is just that idea of don't just say I'm going out and doing a zone 2 ride. Whatever levels or zones you use, make sure you understand them. Make sure you understand the purpose. Otherwise, it's just numbers, and it can take you off course.
Thanks so much, guys.
Oh, thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. We're glad to be here.
Thank you.
That was another episode of Fast Talk. As always, we love your feedback. Email us at fasttalk@velonews.com. Subscribe to Fast Talk on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. And be sure to leave us a rating and a comment. Become a fan of Fast Talk on Facebook at facebook.com/VeloNews. And on Twitter at twitter.com/VeloNews. Fast Talk is a joint production between Velo News and Connor Coaching. The thoughts and opinions expressed on Fast Talk are those of the individual. For Trevor Connor, Dr. Andy Coggan, Dr. Stephen McGregor, Hunter Allen, Colby Pierce, Dr. Stephen Seiler, Sebastian Weber, I'm Chris Case. Thanks for listening.